Is it possible to establish and then maintain a just society? Well, of course, this depends on a number of factors. One of those is, what is the foundation for the society in question in the first place? Is that foundation one which supports the idea of justice and fairness and equality? Or is the foundation something else? A totalitarian foundation, for example, or a reign of tyranny, for example. Certainly, these latter two examples would not foster or promote justice, fairness, and equality. This limits the focus of this question to what remains as a possibility. Certainly, governments or societies which value the notion of democracy or the notion of a representative republic to represent the wishes of the people are in a better position to promote freedom, justice, equality, and fairness. I would also add that we must consider as well the notion of a government founded on the principles of covenant, as in the covenant we see in the Old Testament of the Bible in Exodus, where God, Yahweh, through Moses, his representative prophet, sends a covenant proposal to the nation of Israel. Now, I want to be careful here and explain what I'm not talking about. This is not a theocracy. This is an agreement between two parties. One, the party in authority, the other party, the people. And of course, in the Old Testament, the ultimate authority was the superlative being who is God, Yahweh. So, in that context, one party was God, who agreed to agree with the Jews, the nation of Israel, the people, to have a relationship which would bless the people and guide the people and prevent injustice, unfairness, inequality, all of these things. So it's important to understand that you have to have a beginning point, and the beginning point is the foundation or the presuppositions upon which your government and society are based. Having said that, I would like to revisit for a few minutes the works of Os Guinness, which we have looked at before, but just as a review, his presentation of liberty in the classical good sense of that term, the greatest amount of freedom for everyone, without that turning into the abuse of freedom, or in terms of the government, the abuse of power. Second, I would like to remind you once again of Os Guinness's societal cycle, which he contends, and really I agree with him on this, that the tendency is to go through the four stages of the cycle and have them repeat. He also contends that the cycle never leads to a place, ultimately, where there is freedom, justice, fairness, and equality. And because of this, he argues that the cycle must, in some sense, be broken by the people. But he points out that collective movements of masses of people rarely, if ever, produce that effect. And I agree with him in this. Therefore, it must take individuals to take a stand against the cycle and in their own lives produce something superior, something better, something which really can promote equality, justice, fairness in a society. He calls this, using Soren Kierkegaard's model, the knight of faith, knight as in a knight in armor. And he says the knight of faith is on a quest, and that quest is to follow the ultimate superlative being of all beings, God himself, and to be under God's authority and scrutiny, to live day by day an authentic life existentially. And in so doing, God's presence and God's guidance will equip the knight of faith to become the kind of person who will insist upon and manifest in himself those qualities and characteristics which value every other person as he values himself, and promotes the principles of justice, fairness, and equality. And in so doing, if enough people in a culture do this, the chances dramatically increase to accomplish that goal of a just society. So when we look at liberty, as Os Guinness presents it, he talks about the golden triangle of freedom, of liberty. And he says the 3 points of the triangle are freedom, virtue, and faith. And he points out that freedom is only possible where there is virtue. And virtue is never a collective. Virtue is an individual manifestation, and therefore, virtue must be promoted for each individual in society in order for freedom to exist and be maintained. Because where there is no virtue, there's little reason to protect the freedoms of everyone. The tendency becomes for the individual to look out only for himself or herself. So virtue is very important, but it must be individual and it must be taken seriously. He also points out that virtue depends upon faith, that virtue isn't automatic. Regardless of what anyone says about human nature, virtue, as it is played out in relationships, is not automatic. It requires something greater than itself to inform it so that true virtue becomes the reality. And Os Guinness calls this faith. Now, I would tell you, Os Guinness doesn't believe that this is possible just by having faith in anything, but that faith must be directed toward the only source of virtue that is worthy. And Os Guinness says that that source of virtue is God himself. So, he argues that faith in God, and by God he means the God of the Old and New Testament, the God of the Bible, Judaism and Christianity. And Os Guinness is, of course, a Christian. He is a member, has been a member of the Anglican Church for many years. But his point is that this is not to impose or coerce or force people to believe in the God of the Bible. It's simply to promote the idea that by believing in that God as the ultimate source of authority and goodness, it is possible to experience his revelation of truth concerning these important issues. Therefore, if one has faith in that God, it becomes possible to be virtuous because virtue flows out of those revelations from God. Then it is also possible for freedom to exist as it is protected by true goodness, true virtue. And then finally, Os Guinness says that freedom depends upon faith. Because faith in that superlative being, faith in God, is the only thing that ensures and protects human beings from the abuses of power and from themselves, whereby they might view freedom and liberty as the license to do anything they please. So his golden triangle is really a good model. If we want freedom, we must have virtue. If we want virtue, we must have faith in God. And if we want faith to exist, freedom must exist so that we can make the choice for it. If our culture says you can't believe certain things, then freedom automatically is diminished, and we lose the opportunity for a just society. The second thing I would point out about his golden triangle of freedom is that liberty itself, or freedom itself, is two-pronged. It's like a double-edged sword. One side of the blade is negative freedom, the other side positive. The negative freedom involves the idea of removing barriers to freedom so that human beings can actually exercise their faith and virtue to become people who are just, fair, and equal. For example, slavery is an institution that prohibits freedom, obviously. And this model says that that constitutes a negative aspect concerning freedom. That negative aspect must be removed in order for people to have the opportunity to live as free people. That slavery must go. And of course, we fought a major war in this country to bring that about in the mid-1800s. Now, Os Guinness points out that the removal of the negative forces against freedom is not enough. Once those forces are removed, something must fill that hole or that gap in order for true virtue to occur. And he calls this positive freedom. So, negative freedom is removing the barriers to freedom. Positive freedom is enabling people to make the choices to become the best that they can become in terms of goodness and virtue. And he points out that in our modern culture, oftentimes positive freedom is neglected, overlooked, forgotten, at great expense to the people. Because without positive freedom, that standard of saying, now that you are free to choose, you must choose wisely and choose what is truly, truly good and virtuous. Otherwise, your negative freedom will turn into a corruption and perversion, and freedom will be lost to license or the idea that you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, to whomever you want, and no one has a right to challenge it. And that's a very dangerous thing. And sadly, it's something that we see all too often in our modern context. So, Os Guinness's golden triangle of freedom directly connects with his model of the societal cycle. And if you remember, the societal cycle starts in a repressive phase, which means there is a powerful authority in charge of culture and people, which dictates to them what's okay and what's not, and has the power then to enforce against violations. The ultimate extreme in this regard is seen in tyranny, dictatorship, and is very bad for the people, of course. The people suffer greatly. But there are degrees of repression that don't go to that extreme. Usually, the repressive society is about promoting the idea that authority should be respected and obeyed, and that whatever rules are laid down by the authority should be accepted. Well, this is all fine and good if the authority is a worthy one. But if the authority is weak, or if the authority is limited and finite, if the authority is corrupt, it turns out very bad for the people. And of course, Os Guinness argues the only authority that can never be weak, corrupt, and bad is God himself. But in most situations, socially, culturally, and politically, we see other kinds of authorities rising up, and then we see that corruption and weakness begin to occur, and the lives of the people are affected, making it impossible to really have a just society, because it becomes about power and who has it at the top, not about the equality of all people. This phase, the repressive phase, begins over time to fragment and disintegrate precisely because it can't carry its own load. It can't sustain itself because how much power is enough power to make sure no one opposes? Well, in culture, this can only go so far until the people, if they have the power at all, begin to question and begin to oppose, and in fact, begin to cry for either revolution or rebellion. That phase, moving into that phase, is what Os Guinness calls permissive society, or the permissive phase of the societal cycle. In this phase, the people demand a greater measure of personal freedom and a greater opportunity to express their beliefs, to freely speak their minds, and to follow the path that they feel is most beneficial to them and those they love. So, if they have the power and the voice, we see a shift toward relaxing restraints and controls from repressive society to allow the individual to have more say in his own life and self-determining. Now, this is well and good so long as the individual doesn't tread on those same rights that should belong to others around him. So the permissive phase of the societal cycle promotes the idea of questioning authority, and we're talking here about human authority, because that authority may be good in some cases, but maybe not so good in others, and could become downright evil in some context. So questioning authority becomes a positive thing. But the acknowledgement is still that authority itself is not evil. It just is susceptible to being tempted to do evil alongside doing good. And that's not a bad idea. But as the individuals become more and more free to express themselves, to speak their own minds, to do as they wish, the tendency, of course, and I believe this is because of the corruption of the human spirit as a result of sin, to use a biblical term, the tendency is for the individual to reach and grasp for more and more individual power, which tends to lead to the abuse of personal power at the expense of those around us. When that happens, we begin to move from the permissive stage in the cycle to what is known as the transgressive stage. And transgression is the idea of violating laws, but doing so purposefully. You know what the law says, you just don't like it, so you refuse to comply. Okay? This phase of culture leads to many problems because it pushes individuals toward the perspective of Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, that every person is in a state of war with every other person. And of course, if this is the way we live our lives, we have chaos and anarchy and things fall apart and society becomes very problematic and evil and justice is forgotten. So what happens when we reach a level of transgression in our culture that the center won't hold, that things do in fact fall apart? Well, in the cycle, this can only go on so far because of the destructive elements. And something must happen then to create a restraining force to prevent that destruction, that chaos, anarchy. And this is where, in the societal cycle, we first move into the repressive stage, which is a kind of denial, because in that stage, we pretend that we're not really being transgressive, we're just following our hearts or just exercising our free will. But we're doing it in a transgressive way. So this phase of the societal cycle, which Os Guinness describes as the remissive stage in culture, is very problematic because it constitutes denial of the reality of transgression. We don't think that we're being transgressive. We think we're simply following our hearts. We're doing what our free will enables us to do. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that because we're the ones doing it. So this euphoric feeling we have is that all is well, when in fact there's something very dangerous under the surface. This is exactly like a person who has cancer, whose cancer goes into remission, and they feel as though they're healthy and well, when in fact the cancer is lurking beneath the surface. They still have it. They're not cured. They just feel better. And at what point can that cancer rear its ugly head again? Well, who knows? But it likely will. And certainly in terms of society, it absolutely will rear its ugly head, because it is the nature of transgression to manifest itself, and it will do so at the expense of others. This can only go on so far until finally there has to be an intervention that puts society back on a track where there is restraint and control, so that you don't have utter chaos and anarchy. And this brings us full circle back to the repressive phase of culture and society. And of course, the degree of repression depends upon the amount of chaos, anarchy, and destruction that is occurring. And so this cycle tends to repeat itself over time. Now, as I said, Oskinus says the only way to get a just society is to break the cycle, and the only way to do that is through individuals choosing to break it by placing their faith in God, discovering what true goodness and virtue means from God's revelation, and then expressing the best ideas of what freedom and liberty means for oneself and for everyone else. And this he calls the night of faith, drawing from Kierkegaard's great works, Fear and Trembling, and Sickness unto Death. By the way, this is something well understood by our founding fathers in the United States, who saw this notion of the Golden Triangle and what was necessary to make the Republic sustain itself, to endure with a commitment to freedom, justice, fairness, and equality. In fact, the Declaration of Independence, at the very beginning, makes this clear when it says we hold these truths to be self-evident. They don't have to be proven, they're obvious. That all men, and by men it meant mankind, not just white males from Europe, that all people are created equal. Created, meaning they did not create themselves, but someone greater than them created them as equal. Equal how? Because they all partake of the same imago Dei, image of God. There's no difference. So they're created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, rights that can never be taken away by any person or human authority, because those rights come from God Himself. And these rights include the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to the pursuit of happiness. And I would add that pursuit of happiness is connected by the Founding Fathers directly with possessions and property, because if you can't own things for yourself, your opportunities for fulfillment and for satisfaction are diminished. So they had that in mind. So they understood this concept, and that it was the purpose of the government to uphold these truths and these rights for the people. Because after all, they also said that the government exists for the people and by the people and of the people. The people are what matters. Because God did not create the United States or France or England or China or Russia in His image. God created people, individuals in His image. And that's where the story has to start. That's where the emphasis has to be placed on getting a just society. Now, I'd like to talk for a few minutes with you about some trends and things that have been going on for some time in the world, but primarily apply these to American society, American culture, in the postmodern West. So we look at political theory in the postmodern West, and I'm going to title it, just to allude to Joseph Conrad and his novel, I'm going to title it The Heart of Darkness, because in fact there is a heart of darkness at work. Now, this is not doom and gloom, it's not fatalism, because something can be done about it. But the trends, the tendencies do exist and are visible that want to thwart the idea of a just society, that are currently attacking the notions of equality for all, justice for all, fairness for all. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few of these and just talk through them briefly to give you a focus for what I think we're facing in our modern world that need to be addressed. And keep in mind, addressing these things must first be the individual addressing these things in his or her life and becoming their best self. The first of these I call the mudslide effect. This is a social context that arises from a combination of philosophical commitments which produce a mudslide or snowball effect in culture. It's inevitable as a consequence when one replaces one set of philosophical presuppositions with another set which stand in stark contrast with the originals. For example, to replace the viewpoint that human life has meaning with the viewpoint that human life is absurd and meaningless cannot help but produce effects and consequences consistent with the new perspective. The mudslide effect occurs when multiple philosophical perspectives are replaced within a single specific cultural context, causing the consequences and effects to become seemingly overwhelming and impossible to resist. Another way of looking at this is the multiplication of problems facing individuals and society. And so the foundation that might be able to address all of those in a meaningful way is replaced with other foundations that are temporal, ephemeral, and lacking the power to fix the problem. So these other approaches attempt to address the problem but rarely fix anything. And I should add, there's not just one problem, there are multiple problems. These multiply and multiply so that they become overwhelming. So imagine, if you will, a mudslide coming down a mountainside and it destroys everything in its path because it's so immense and overwhelming. Or an avalanche, if you will, in the Rocky Mountains. The snow starts coming down, and as it comes down, it just keeps building into a tidal wave of ice and snow, destroying everything in its path. This effect causes some people to lose all hope and to just give up. Second, I would talk about what I would call the completest revolution of all: conscious and subconscious rejection of foundations. This is very important, and the foundations I'm talking about are primarily Judeo-Christian root foundations, philosophical roots of Judaism and Christianity, which are the best approaches for protecting freedom, equality, and fairness and justice. Now, I would also include the Greco-Roman root because it has much to say about these issues as well. I personally don't think that the Greco-Roman root accomplishes the goal as well as the Judeo-Christian. However, it is important. In fact, both cultural roots from the past are essential. The Greco-Roman root involves the rejection of the best of Greece and Rome. That foundation is abandoned. The viewpoint that humanity is somehow a glorious creation and that human beings are capable of great things because humanity is innately and intrinsically meaningful, both individually, but also collectively, in community and relationship. That's a great idea, and it's a good one. However, the Judeo-Christian root does a better job, precisely because it appeals to the highest authority of all, God Himself, as the creator of human beings, and endowing them with rights and instilling in them His image, the image of God, the Imago Dei. This results in transcendent metaphysical meaning and purpose for humans, which may be expressed and lived in an empirical social context. So, both viewpoints understand and express that God has created glorious, magnificent beings that we call human beings. But the Judeo-Christian view presents which God exactly, who that God is, what he is like, and provides the standard above all standards for virtue, goodness, and how we should live together. The third issue I think we're facing is what I would refer to in this way. All that is solid melts into the air. For example, the quote, death of God, the state of flux. The only thing that's permanent is change. The uncertainties that arise from the loss of meaning and purpose. The tendency to look at life as though it is meaningless and absurd, and there is no hope to find meaning. These three forces, the death of God, the state of flux, and uncertainty, have largely contributed to a, quote, death culture of modernity. They have effectively promoted the ideas that death is preferable, at least in some social contexts, and God is non-existent or at best irrelevant to human concerns. That everything is in a state of fluidity and constant change, resulting in zero certainty regarding life and truth, because nothing is permanent, nothing lasts. And yet, these perspectives are ironically contradictory regarding life and truth, and they contradict themselves, promoting themselves as final answers and expressions of ultimate truth, which of course violates the principle of logic known as the law of non-contradiction. You can't say that the only thing that is absolute is the state of flux and uncertainty, because uncertainty is not absolute by its very nature, and change is not absolute because of its very nature. Well, these three social forces have the effect of overwhelming the individual with radical negative consequences for society as a whole and for the individual in particular. Contributing factors to this problem are the radical relativizing of claims, the proliferation of choices facing individuals, and the rapidity of change. Things are happening so fast in so many different ways that it's overwhelming to many people. And the choices are just dazzling and blinding. And this is because most people have not figured out the ultimate core reality that speaks to everything else, and thereby provides for a way to discern and eliminate some of those options as evil and bad and discard them in preference for those that are good and lasting. The fourth area I would say we're facing in modern culture that's very important and problematic is the loneliness and isolation of the individual. I call this the myth of social constructionism, a context in which individuals feel despair, isolation, loneliness. They feel as though they're all on their own and it's all up to them individually to find the answers and produce the changes for everyone. One aspect of social constructionism is, ironically, the deconstruction of the past, which is the nihilistic vision. Nihilism is the anti-philosophy. Anti in two senses. One, that it directly opposes other views, and two, that it becomes the replacement of those views. So nihilism, in its essence, is not concerned with justice. Nihilism, from the Latin, means nothingness, but nothingness in the sense of an emptiness of all meaning, value, purpose. It is not concerned with grace, mercy, compassion, fairness, or love. Thus, justice, fairness, equality are not an issue for nihilism. The result for nihilism is a great and inevitable failure. This great failure for modern, postmodern nihilism is clearly visible in its naive faith that the destruction of all other philosophies and traditions of the past will somehow result in something better. In fact, postmodern nihilism lacks the foundation necessary to produce the positive consequences or results it espouses, and it is absolutely impotent to provide such a foundation, because the only foundation that can do this is the one they reject as the most essential and vital principle of its philosophy. As Ivan Turgenev astutely observed in his Russian novel, Fathers and Sons, written in the mid-1800s, a groundbreaking indictment of nihilism in 19th century Russia. Nihilism can only destroy. It is incapable of creating. Therefore, nihilism must resort to blind faith that whatever arises following nihilistic destruction will somehow be a utopian ideal, which is in fact impossible, because, as I have told you before, utopia literally means no such place. It is a fantasy, and a dark fantasy when nihilism imposes its will upon it. Furthermore, nihilism has also been a miserable failure in terms of deconstructing the past. People insist on believing in something, despite the efforts of nihilism to destroy this philosophical perspective. In fact, belief in something greater than oneself is the overwhelming majority philosophical viewpoint in the world, as it has always been throughout history. In addition, places where nihilistic philosophical perspectives have been attempted on a social level, the results have been tragic in terms of human suffering and death. Strong evidence of nihilism's inability to achieve the mysterious utopia it claims will inevitably occur. Once again, nihilism is not concerned with justice. Neither is it concerned with grace, mercy, compassion, fairness, or love, and certainly not with equality. Nihilism's only concern is power, specifically the will to power. This means the power to impose one's will on others, and this is all that matters. One can easily recognize where this kind of philosophical position leads, and the results are always horrific. And this is not conjecture, this is actual evidence from our history. All one has to do is look at the past 125 years to see those effects. There are three maxims that must be considered at this point, and I call these, quote, it's all in the mind. It's all in what we decide and make up. First, there are no givens, no certainties in human life. Second, there are no rules in human relationships. And third, there are no limits to human endeavors or actions. These three maxims capture the essence of nihilistic philosophy and the nihilistic vision. Logic and reason pose the linchpin question concerning nihilism. What will be the logical and inevitable consequences in human lives and relationships if the nihilistic philosophy is embraced and consistently lived? In addition, what does evidence, that is, facts, actually demonstrate concerning the effects and results in lives which pursue nihilism as a worldview? Common sense leads to only one conclusion. Anything, no matter how evil or destructive, becomes not only possible, but will likely be seen as preferable. The consequence of no limits and no restraints on human choices and actions always leads to harm, human suffering, heartache, and death. Dostoevsky pointed out eloquently in his writings that when we give up a belief in God or ignore God's existence and His guidance, His revelation, it doesn't mean that things become impossible. It means that everything becomes possible and likely, no matter how evil and corrupt and destructive it may be. Therefore, in the postmodern world, the Thanatos syndrome, or the death wish, becomes the only option when one embraces the nihilistic worldview and its consequences. The next issue that I think is important for modern life and modern culture, I call the rise of transhumanism and posthumanism, as seen in the Übermensch Superman desire. The quest is the hope of redeeming humanism to replace God's provision of grace and salvation. In other words, no longer is God viewed as the creator, savior, sustainer of human life, and all life, in fact, but man himself, through his humanistic efforts, and you can read into that through his philosophy and technology, whether that is mechanical technology, as in computers, AI, and so forth, or biological technology, as in genetic manipulation. Man becomes the center of what it means to be man. And ironically, man is rapidly moving toward replacing man with something else, something other than man, that he naively identifies as superior to man, as in what Adolf Hitler did with the Übermensch Aryan race, and what Nietzsche promoted in his book Antichrist, with the idea that the Superman must replace Christ and what he represents as the fullest expression of God's image with something that is created by human beings. So the pursuit in this involves embracing the how while ignoring the why. The quest involves adopting a post-Christian viewpoint which emphasizes a few elements that are essential to understand if people wish to meaningfully analyze and evaluate the nihilistic ideal of the Übermensch, or the Superman, which personally I believe is the Antichrist in the sense of the one opposing what Christ represents as the Imago Dei and replacing it. Nihilism asserts that humanity as originally created is flawed and inferior to the nihilistic vision of what humanity can become. This view denies the Imago Dei, the image of God, and the state of sinlessness and grace presented in the Bible as the original human reality. Also, humanity as it currently exists is inferior to the nihilistic vision of what humanity can become. This view denies the biblical position that mankind, even in a fallen state, fallen from grace and sinful in his condition, still retains the Imago Dei and is therefore the apex of created life. Also, human knowledge apart from God has surpassed God and has equipped humanity to recreate human identity in ways that are vastly superior to the past and the present, and if God should exist after all, to God's original vision and his implementation of that vision in the original creation of human beings. This perspective has opened the door to the uses of technologies and socio-political theories for the purposes of transforming humanity into something entirely other than what humanity has been. This is clearly visible in biochemical engineering experimentation involving human-animal hybrids, synthetic fusions of humans and machines, perhaps even extraterrestrial human hybrids, and the reprogramming of human consciousness to view traditional biological and non-biological human identity as flawed and inferior to what may result from nihilistic postmodern engineering. Consider the impact of superhero movies in our culture and television shows in this same context. The horror fiction of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the science fiction of H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau no longer seem far-fetched. The 2010 film Splice addresses these issues with chilling effectiveness. For an abundance of information on these topics, search the internet for transhumanism and posthumanism and visit Dr. Tom Horn's website for access to several well-researched and documented books dealing with these issues. I would note in particular and recommend Tom Horn's book, in which he served as the editor, The Milieu, which unpacks from a wide range of expert sources what's going on in this kind of research. Well, there are two singularities certainly at odds in our modern world. The first, the Judeo-Christian Imago Dei, image of God vision. The second, the anti-God, nihilistic vision. And it is all up to each one of us which one we will choose. I would like to conclude by pointing out that there are two views that have direct consequences that are inevitable. The first is God as creator, as seen through the singularity called the Big Bang, in which humility and wonder should permeate every individual as they look at the cosmos and contemplate a being so great and outside of that cosmos who could create such a thing and then create human beings to have special relationships with him. This is, of course, what Einstein identified as the singularity and has commonly come to be known as the Big Bang. And I would point out to you that according to the Bible, the singularity in question is actually the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, where in both the Old and New Testament says, everything that exists, created, exists because of him, through him, and for him. And therefore, those who put their faith in him can have tremendous confidence that he is watching and caring and will take care of everything. The second view is what I call the whimper. It is the view that says man's hubris and self-love can be responsible for everything. And of course, while there is no explanation for how human beings could have brought about the creation of the cosmos, once it's created and we are in it, we become supreme. It is a remarkable display of hubris, arrogance, and ego. Now, I would like to conclude with a couple of items. One is a poem by T.S. Eliot that was written in the early 20th century, but it powerfully addresses the nihilistic postmodern failure. Long before this philosophical viewpoint became the dominant viewpoint in Western culture in the late 20th century. His poem is at once prophetic and cautionary. But when hubris and self-love override humility and wonder, destruction and death become inevitable. The second poem is called The Second Coming, written by William Butler Yeats, the great Irish poet, and it's a take again on where we are headed. Now, it's a prophetic kind of poem because it taps into the ideas in the Bible and the book of Revelation and references elsewhere in the Bible about where we're going when a faith in God is lost and replaced with a faith in ourselves. And then finally, I'm going to share my humble attempt to capture what both the Hollow Men and Yeats' poem, The Second Coming, express through a short piece of music that I will tag the end of this lecture with, that I hope you find interesting and enjoy, and I hope it makes you think more deeply about all of these issues. The Hollow Men, T.S. Eliot. Mr. Kurtz, he dead. A penny for the old guy. We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men. Leaning together, headpiece filled with straw, alas. Our dried voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass, or rat's feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. Shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom, remember us, if at all, not as lost violent souls, but only as the hollow men, the stuffed men. Eyes I dare not meet in dreams in death's dream kingdom, these do not appear. There the eyes are sunlight on a broken column, There is a tree swinging, and voices are in the wind singing, more distant and more solemn than a fading star. Let me be no nearer in death's dream kingdom. Let me also wear such deliberate disguises, rat's coat, crowskin, cross staves, in a field, behaving as the wind behaves, no nearer. Not that final meeting in the twilight kingdom. This is the dead land. This is cactus land. Here the stone images are raised. Here they receive the supplication of a dead man's hand under the twinkle of a fading star. Is it like this in death's other kingdom, waking alone at the hour when we are trembling with tenderness, lips that would kiss form prayers to broken stone? The eyes are not here. There are no eyes here. In this valley of dying stars, in this hollow valley, this broken jaw of our lost kingdoms. In this last of meeting places, we grope together and avoid speech, gathered on this beach of the tumid river, sightless unless the eyes reappear, as the perpetual star multifoliate rose of death's twilight kingdom, the hope only of empty men. Here we go round the prickly pear, prickly pear, prickly pear. Here we go round the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow. Life is very long. Between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom, for thine is, life is, for thine is the. This is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang but a whimper. The Second Coming, William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening jeer, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with a lion body and the head of a man. A gaze, blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born?
Turning, ever turning in a widening jeer, the shadow of the falcon flying. The spirit of the ages, the spirit of fear, in souls alone and crying. Beware the blood-dimmed tide, the innocence has died, where will you go to hide before the second coming? Spiritus Mundi is a troubling sight, lost in a wasteland hazy, slowly moving through the fading light of a demon's empty gazing. Beware the blood-dimmed tide, the innocence has died. Where will you go to hide before the second coming? Beware the blood-dimmed tide, the innocence has died. Where will you go to hide before the second coming? The falling darkness of the stony sleep, the cradle rocking everlasting, a nightmare creature rising from the deep appears to break his fasting, appears to dine at last. Beware the blood-dimmed tide, the innocence has died. Where will you go to hide before the second coming? Beware the blood-dimmed tide, the truth has been denied. There is no place to hide before the second coming. There is no place to hide before the second coming. There is no place to hide before the second coming. There is no place to hide before the second coming. Before the second coming. Before the second coming.